Thank you, Senator Ludwig. I propose the question that the Senate does now adjourn, and I call Senator McKenzie.
Thank you very much, Mr President. And I just briefly tonight wanted to spend some time updating the Senate on a round of consultation that the government is undertaking on behalf of the education backbench. And indeed, over 30 rural and regional government senators and members from right around the country have been very, very concerned for a long time about access to higher education by country students, recognising, of course, that there are issues of achievement, which goes obviously to state governments and local school districts, issues around aspiration, about whether a young person aspires to actually even attend a higher education institution. And that goes to questions of family background, socioeconomic status, and indeed I think the broader community that a young person grows up in what are the usual expectations for that young person once they are post-schooling. And obviously for rural and regional students in particular, access, and that means access to accommodation and the capacity to overcome the very significant financial barriers that those young people and indeed their families have to overcome in order to access higher education and exercise their choice in where they choose to pursue their career options. So over the break, Mr President, I travelled around a variety of regional communities, meeting with local members and their local community. We started off in Bendigo. We opened the batting in Bendigo, which was fantastic, and obviously then went into the seat of Indi, where we held a forum in Wangaratta, which was very well attended by students, by education professionals, by parents, and what I found very interesting, Mr President, was grandparents that were actually turning up to have a conversation about how their young people were going to be assisted to access higher education. I'd briefly like to thank both Minister Morrison and Minister Pyne for providing secretarial support for this round of consultations and indeed sending department officials out into the regions to actually hear firsthand what the stories behind the data. And I think the officials themselves have found that incredibly empowering and incredibly useful as they then go on to produce the final report that will be presented to ministers to actually then come up with some policy solutions to address the issue. But what we heard in Wangaratta were that parents were delaying retirement, that parents were delaying paying into their superannuation, that they were actually bringing down mortgage repayments in order to find the extra cash to send their students, primarily to Melbourne, to access higher education. We then went to Shepparton, the seat of Murray, with Dr Sharman Stone, another very passionate advocate for access to higher education for regional students. And the main topic discussed there was the gap year was such a misnomer. It's actually a gap 2 years. So because of the workforce participation criteria that is structured around accessing independent youth allowance, young people from regional and rural areas have to work over 30 hours over an 18-month period, which essentially means they have to find the additional cash early and head off to after they've deferred for a year, or indeed take 2 years off, which most universities don't even allow them to do. So to call it a gap year for country kids is a classic case of using imaginary numbers where 1 doesn't equal 2. We then headed to Narrabri with the fabulous Mark Colton, who's been advocating on this issue very strongly, not only in his local community but nationally and here in this place over a long period of time. We went to the Narrabri Bowling Club and had a significant number of locals there travelling from a wide space. And again, the issues went to financial barriers, but what an interesting aspect that came out of Narrabri was the issue of drought and the consistency of cash flow. The rent has to be paid every month. When you're living away from home, the rent has to be paid every month. But when you're in a drought and you're not getting that cash flow in on a regular basis, and indeed when a whole region or a community is in drought, that issue isn't just for farming families. Indeed, it's for the small business families in the large towns and business centres. So I thought that was quite an interesting and a new idea that had been presented to the committee. Off to Wagga Wagga with the passionate and unstoppable Michael McCormick, where we actually went out to Charles Sturt University, a university that prides itself on providing access locally to regional students and also conducting a lot of research that's important for the economic development of regional Australia going forward. Where I also heard about local initiatives and sponsorship of students. There were actually initiatives in the local community where they were concerned about how were they going to assist their young people access the higher education so that they in the community had access to the skill sets and professionals that they needed, whether they be doctors, nurses, engineers, to actually ensure the economic growth of their communities. And so they had a range of community scholarships to overcome some of those financial barriers, which I thought was quite interesting. Then headed over west last week to Nola Merino country down in Bunbury. What a beautiful part of the world it is. And Nola's only about yay high, but she fights hard for her community and fights very, very hard for young people's access to higher education. Albany with Rick Wilson, where we had over 60 locals rock up, some travelling over 300 kilometres to simply be there to have input into the process. And what I heard there consistently, which I hadn't heard elsewhere, was the importance of telecommunications and Mr Turnbull getting very serious about rolling out the NBN into regional communities so that they can access higher education through the provision of online technologies. A very, very important thing for that community. Then off to Moora with Melissa Price in the seat of Durack, and where predominantly the day centred around discussion of the quality of high school attainment and the provision of quality high school education in regional areas and what impact that was having. So basically that community said with one voice that if, as a community and as a bunch of parents, if they wanted their children to go to higher education, if the children aspired to go on to tertiary education, they had to send their children away, and at a very young age, off to Perth. And so I think there's issues for state governments, there's issues for local communities and parents, but there are definitely issues for us as a government. Over the coming weeks, we'll be heading off to Coffs Harbour, Port Augusta, Barnaby Joyce country, down with Eric Hutchinson in Tasmania, Mr President, Rockhampton, right across the country to actually assess what community feels and what they see as some of the local solutions. And we've been hearing a lot of good, positive ideas, but a lot of concerning issues. I mean, we've heard of one parent talking of their son having to live in the car because the payments were rejected by Centrelink, the number of times they've had to actually resubmit their paperwork, take days off work to actually stand in the queues, only to be told on one hand one set of information to have another the next day. Please do something. Our children can't eat dirt when they go away to the city. One of the things I think we don't talk about is the emotional cost, and we heard that time and time again. I'm reminded of a mother in Shepparton talking about having to counsel her child through a very stressful period prior to exams in their first semester, and they're that far away from them they can't actually just get in the car and go and provide that physical support. The young people are away from their families, from their friends, from all that they see as normal and supportive, I guess, in times of great stress. And so this is a significant issue. I guess one of the consistent things we heard from students themselves is that they are aware of the additional costs that their desire to go and get a tertiary education impact that has on their family budgets, and that they are making very real decisions not to pursue higher education, not to choose to live away. They're choosing other options, other avenues which are less than what they want, and in many cases less than their potential and their capacity. And indeed, educating regional students not only, I think, gives the world access to some highly intelligent and resilient human beings in the boardrooms of the world, but indeed gives us a labour supply of professionals that are more likely to return to regional areas in order to continue our economic development. I look forward to updating the Senate when I return on the outcome of our further consultations, and I'd really like to commend not only the ministers but indeed my coalition colleagues for their passion and support around this issue, and I'm really looking forward to delivering a result on behalf of the many, many parents, education professionals and students that I've been hearing from for over the last 6 weeks.
Thank you.